Welcome back to The Shape of Knowing. My name is Jen. To fill you in a bit, I'm a 51-year-old undergrad majoring in psychology, graduating in December. This summer, I'm doing a student-designed independent study. It is a 4-paper study called Metaphor, Language, and Theoretical Structure. Sounds super boring. I know. Well, the first paper actually is super boring. It's very technical, but it sets up some of the foundation for the other 3 papers that are not boring at all. I already started them, and it's actually been super fun writing them. So I finished and turned in paper 1 already, and I'm going to read it today. So, um, so today I'm going to be looking down because I have my computer right here in front of me, and um, I'm going to just read my paper as I wrote it. And so I'll be looking down, not at the camera. Um, but I also want to, I'm going to take some time to explain things as I go. Some things might be relevant, some things might not. Who knows? But it'll be a fun ride. Um, but I just want to explain some things so you don't get lost or bored out of your mind. I'll try to explain some things in ways that you can understand. And other things I'm just going to read because what I'm explaining or what they're explaining, um, we would be here forever. It'd be a very, very, very long podcast today. So, and I don't want it to be too long. So I'll explain some things and other things I'm just going to leave alone. So let's get started. So, metaphor, language, and theoretical structure, paper 1 of 4. From pragmatics to metaphor, tracing the path toward a theory of structural transfer. By me, Jenny. From pragmatics to metaphor, tracing the path toward a theory of structural transfer. Setting the pathway. This paper is a pathway paper. This paper does not present the full theory of structural transfer yet. It traces the intellectual movement that made my theory question possible in the first place. A good starting point for this is language as it appears in everyday usage. Social, contextual, adaptive, shaped by speaker, audience, identity, and purpose. The destination is metaphor as a possible mechanism of structural transfer across domains. Between those 2 points is the question this paper follows. If language is never only word level meaning and metaphor is not merely decorative language, what exactly moves when one domain is used to understand another? What is that movement in between there? The pathway begins with pragmatics and sociolinguistics, then moves through translation, metaphor, conceptual structure, and scientific models. 3 theoretical anchors carry that movement. Max Black, who argues against treating metaphor as simple substitution. Now, if you've been following along any of my other previous podcasts, my first podcast was about metaphors, and I was kind of working through Max Black at the time and some of Blackoff and Johnson. But you can refer to me working some of that out and how that ended up in this paper. You'll see it, some things I talked about there and how it ended up in this paper. Okay, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who argue that metaphor structures thought and action. And that too, I also talked about in also my previous podcasts. I talked about them a lot, and you'll see how what I talked about in my previous podcasts, how that ended up in this paper, or how that transformed from there to now, even. And Mary Hesse, who connects metaphor and analogy to scientific explanation and theory formation. Now, I didn't talk much about Hesse. She's very technical. And she also, I had to digest her work a lot. And her work for me didn't come, I have a lot in this paper about Hesse, but um, her work brought other pieces together in other papers for me. So that's why I didn't talk about her in my previous podcast, because her work for me, when I was reading her and digesting her work, kind of adjusted to like later papers. So together, they give me the foundation to ask not just what metaphor means, but what structure comes along with that meaning, including assumptions, limits, and interpretive rules, and how much of it actually gets unpacked. The first stage, pragmatics and sociolinguistics. The first stage of this pathway came out of a final paper I wrote for The Nature of Language, Linguistics 316. I'm going to stop here too. A few semesters ago, I took a class called The Nature of Language. It was a linguistics class. And I have to fully admit that I was very disappointed, because I thought I was taking like this deep, romantic almost view of linguistics class, of like I was going to learn all these things about language, that these beautiful parts, not poetic, but just, you know, these different veins that I'd never learned before. And the class ended up being more about, my teacher taught us much more about how he was focusing on bilingualism. And because I was probably the only one taking that class, thinking it was going to be more romantic view of language, and everyone else was bilingual, and they were learning translation problems. And that's where I started to see a lot of the problems with language and the translation problems between two languages, because I'm not bilingual. I only know English. And just observing what they were talking about and the problems they were having, it was, to me, it was, I saw more, I saw the problem, and the solution that they used to get there, to transfer meaning and pragmatics. It was amazing to me in sociolinguistics. And but I watched it going, oh, what I learned was the translation problem, and then how we fix that and bring meaning back into the words, is referring back to the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, through that. Anyways, you'll hear that in a later paper. But so my linguistics class was actually quite enlightening, but in a totally different way I ever imagined. And so, long story long, really, my final paper that I wrote is what I'm referring to in this next part of my paper for paper one. So that class taught me to pay closer attention to something I had not had a name for before. That ordinary speakers shift register, code switch, and signal identity constantly without ever consciously deciding to do so. I watched that happen in an interview I conducted for that paper. Someone moving from casual speech to a more formal register at work, sounding proper around adults without being able to say why or even noticing he was doing it, until it was pointed out to him. My conclusion was not really about identity, which was the assignment's actual focus. It was more basic. Language isn't a formal system. It's a situated action, and meaning isn't something words carry by themselves. That conclusion is also where the deeper question started for me. If meaning depends this much on who's speaking to whom and why, what exactly happens when the meaning has to move somewhere else, between speakers, between languages? And that's the language that I'm talking about, is when bilingual people, they translate from one language to another, and that translation problem. And where does that meaning go? Or if that's meaning is lost in that translation problem. And a lot of the times meaning is lost. And that's one thing I learned, um, and and I also, there was a girl in the class that she knew like 8 or 9 languages fluently. Hats off to her. Um, it's an amazing feat, especially someone like me who only knows one. Um, so the translation between all those is what they're talking about. Anyways, so where am I at? The conclusion is also where the deeper question started. If meaning depends this much on who's speaking to whom and why, what exactly happens when the meaning has to move somewhere else, between speakers, between languages, between disciplines, or into metaphor, where one thing gets described entirely in terms of another? What I have not specified yet is what the context actually consists of. A sentence does not arrive alone. It arrives through a speaker, a situation, a relationship, a purpose, a tone, or an expectation. Even the most ordinary exchange carries more than its dictionary meaning, because the social setting decides how the words get heard before the words themselves do any deciding. If language is never just about words, then translation can not only be word replacement. Something more than vocabulary has to move between speakers, languages, disciplines, and systems. Context has to move. Use has to move. Implication has to move. And when language becomes metaphorical, the problem gets deeper, because metaphor does not merely transfer a word from one place to another, it carries a structure along with it. And tracing that structure is what the rest of this paper has to do. The translation problem, meaning beyond word replacement. Translation has to account for what words do inside a situation, not only what they appear to mean in isolation. That's not only a problem between human languages, it shows up just as much in movement between disciplinary languages, theoretical vocabularies, and systems of interpretation. A term can move from one context into another and appear to remain the same while carrying different assumptions, limits, and implications underneath it. That's where the pragmatic problem becomes a metaphor problem specifically. If ordinary meaning already exceeds word replacement, metaphor makes that excess impossible to ignore. Max Black, metaphor is not substitution. I'm actually going to speak page numbers and everything because I don't want to get in trouble for not giving credit where credit is due. Max Black gives the pathway its first real theoretical language for why metaphor isn't word replacement. In Metaphor, Black writes, "So to call a sentence an instance of metaphor is to say something about its meaning, not about its orthography, its phonetic pattern, or its grammatical form." Black, page 28. Metaphor isn't a surface feature of language. It isn't the appearance of a word, the sound of it, or the grammatical shape of a sentence. It belongs to meanings, and meaning is already relational, contextual, and interpretive. That's the first real support for moving past just translation as substitution and into metaphor as interaction. Black then shows exactly how metaphor works inside a sentence. Using the example, "The chairman plowed through the discussion," he writes, "Let us call the word plowed the focus of the metaphor, and the remainder of the sentence in which the word occurs, the frame." Black, page 28. Metaphor doesn't happen through a word just floating alone. The metaphorical force of plowed depends entirely on the frame around it. In one context, plowing refers literally to soil. In another, it reorganizes how a reader understands a chairman moving through a discussion. The word arrives with structure, but the surrounding context decides how its metaphorical meaning actually arrives. Black's interaction view moves metaphor beyond the idea that one word simply replaces another. That's in my other podcast. You'll hear me saying that. Metaphor works because the secondary or subsidiary subject brings a whole system of meanings into relation with the primary or principal subject. Black explains this with man is a wolf, writing that the idea of a wolf is part of a system of ideas. Black, page 40. The metaphor doesn't transfer only the word wolf. It activates a system of associated meanings. Predation, danger, wildness, instinct, social threat, whatever implications the language community attaches to that image. The metaphor works because those implications get brought into contact with man. This is the beginning of the structural problem. If metaphor activates a system of ideas, it's already doing more than just naming alone. It's importing relations, expectations, and interpretive force from one domain to another. Black makes the structural force of metaphor clearer when he explains that what wolf metaphor does to the subject it describes. The wolf metaphor suppresses some details, emphasizes others, in short, organizes our view of man. Black, page 41. Metaphor doesn't just add color to language, it reorganizes attention. Some features of the principal subject become more visible while others recede. The metaphor doesn't neutrally describe, it filters, it selects, and it arranges. If a metaphor can organize how a subject is viewed, it can carry more than meaning from one domain to another. It can carry assumptions about relevance, hierarchy, danger, agency, value, or limitation. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a second because I don't want to lose anybody. What does all that mean? So man as wolf, let's just start there. So what is he talking about? Okay, so we'll start with the wolf is part of a system of ideas. Okay, so we'll do it like this. I have an idea. Okay, so man, we have man, and we have wolf, right? So this is the metaphor describing man. Now, my idea of man is this. And your idea of man is this. All right? Now, we both see wolf, but this is the outcome. This is what the metaphor does when it selects. So what actually is happening is I see man as wolf is describing, I see wolf as only picking and choosing and saying man is we'll define this guy as wolf as on four legs and furry, and I think it's funny, right? And you think wolf is scary, angry, it's gonna attack, it's hungry. Okay, so that's how you see the metaphor of wolf. And now that is a metaphor doing work of what selects, what is suppressing, and what is is more visible in the metaphor. So for me, the metaphor is something that's funny. So to me, it's the metaphor of man as wolf is a funny thing. He's hairy on four legs. And to you, the metaphor is scary, even though the sentence is still man as wolf. So that's what Black is talking about. um, in what he's describing in everything I just went through. With importing relations, expectations, interpretive force from one domain to another. But it's also like once man is defined funny, my interpretation of him is different. Other people's interpretation of man as wolf is different. Funny, he's seen funny, or he's seen as scary. So that's how a metaphor can do real work. What's selective and what's receded, what's not seen. So Black makes the structural force of metaphor clear when he explains what the wolf metaphor does to the subject it describes. I just described that. So I'm a paragraph. I'm reading that now. The wolf metaphor suppresses some details, emphasizes others, in short, organizes our view of man. Black, page 41. Metaphor doesn't just add color to language, it reorganizes attention. Some features of the physical subject become more visible, others recede. The metaphor doesn't neutrally describe, it filters, selects, and arranges. If metaphor can organize how a subject is viewed, it can carry more than meaning from one domain to another. It can carry assumptions about relevance, hierarchy, danger, agency, value, or limitation. So I hope that made more sense. Black then names the actual mechanism behind the organizing effect. The metaphor works by applying to the principal subject a system of associated implications, characteristic of subsidiary subject. Black, page 44. It isn't a single isolated meaning moving across. It's a whole system of implications. The subsidiary subject brings a network of assumptions, associations, and expectations that start shaping how the principal subject gets understood, which raises a few questions. What kind of system is being applied? How much of it actually gets unpacked? And how does that change interpretation? The fullest statement of this organizing force comes when Black turns directly to what happens to the principal subject. The metaphor selects, emphasizes, suppresses, and organizes features of the principal subject by implying statements about it that normally apply to the subsidiary subject. Black, page 44 to 45. Metaphor doesn't only apply meaning from one subject to another, it changes how the principal subject is perceived, selecting some features, emphasizing others, suppressing others, organizing the whole field of interpretation through implications carried from the subsidiary subject. Metaphor transfers more than description. It transfers an interpretive structure that shapes what can be noticed, what becomes important, and what may disappear from view. So now we're on to Lakoff and Johnson. Metaphor as conceptual structure. Black's interaction view establishes that metaphor isn't a decorative substitute for literal language. It's a relation between systems of implication. But his account still leaves a bigger question open. Does metaphor only affect particular expressions, or does it participate in the structure of thought itself? That's where George Lakoff and Mark Johnson take the pathway further. Where Black shows us metaphor working by bringing one system of implications into relation with another subject, Lakoff and Johnson argue that metaphor is not limited to individual sentences or literary language at all. It's part of the conceptual system people use to think, act, interpret, and organize experience. Right away, they push back on the ordinary assumption that metaphor belongs mainly to poetry, rhetoric, or unusual language. We have found, on the contrary, that metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language, but in thought and action. Lakoff and Johnson, page 3. That moves this whole pathway from metaphor as a feature of expression into metaphor as a feature of cognition. If metaphor participates in thought and action, it can't just be language tacked on after the thinking already happened. It's helping organize how people perceive situations, reason about them, act with them, and that takes Black's interaction view and expands it into a much broader theory of conceptual organization. Here's the actual definition. The essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. Lakoff and Johnson, page 5. That helps name the movement between domains for this whole pathway. Metaphor isn't just a word choice, it's a way of organizing one kind of experience through another kind entirely. In the statement, the words in terms of carry structural labor beneath their phrasing. And I go back to what I quoted. The essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. So I'm going to go read this again. In the statement, the words in terms of carry structural labor beneath their phrasing. That's really a heavy term, in terms of. It implies more than surface resemblance. It suggests that a source domain can actually provide the organizing logic a target domain gets interpreted, experienced, and acted on through. Their argument is war. Their argument as is war example shows the structuring is powerful but never total. Argument is partially structured, understood, performed, and talked about in terms of war. Lakoff and Johnson, page 5. The war partially is doing precise conceptual work, but it's describing how much of argument gets reorganized, not how much of war transfers across. The whole war system comes along compressed. Supply lines, morale, terrain, weapons, all of it. But only certain pieces get unpacked and put to work. Attack, defense, strategy, winning, losing, gaining ground. The rest of war structure is still there, it's just never activated for the particular metaphor. And that's exactly the shape my own theory really needed. Structural transfer isn't selective at the point of transfer. It's what's selective is which parts of the already complete structure actually get unpacked and used. In chapter 2, they make a point that's easy to skip but shouldn't be. Because the metaphorical concept is systematic, the language we use to talk about that aspect of the concept is systematic. Lakoff and Johnson, page 7. Applied to argument is war specifically. A portion of the conceptual work of battle partially characterizes the concept of an argument, and the language follows suit. Lakoff and Johnson, page 7. Metaphor doesn't just hand you a single expression. It hands you the whole pattern relation between two domains. Compressed into that expression, battle doesn't reorganize argument wholesale. Only part of battle network gets unpacked to do that work, but the network itself arrived intact. That's the piece this pathway needed. Metaphor carries structured conceptual relations, not just individual word meanings, and carries all of them, even the ones that stay dormant. Their chapter on highlighting and hiding gets at the cost of all this. The very systematicity, I can write, I just can't speak, that allows us to comprehend one aspect of a concept in terms of another will necessarily hide other aspects of the concept. Lakoff and Johnson, page 10. Metaphor doesn't just reveal meaning, it actively directs attention away from whatever doesn't fit. With argument is war active, the conflict structure is what you see. The cooperative or exploratory side of arguing can disappear entirely. This is where metaphor shows its limits along with its force. It organizes understanding, but that organizing is never innocent. Highlighting some relations always mean hiding others. Their discussion on the conduit metaphor turns the mechanism on language itself. Ordinary language treats ideas like objects, words like containers, communication like sending those containers to someone else, but metaphor hides the role of context entirely. After walking through examples where meaning depend on speaker, listener, and situation, they land on it directly. The meaning is not right there in the sentence. Lakoff and Johnson, page 12. That connects straight back to pragmatics. Meaning doesn't just sit inside words waiting to be extracted. It's shaped by context, social position, intention, interpretation, use. Metaphor can't be a simple transfer of verbal content if meaning was never right there in the sentence to begin with. Metaphorical meaning has to be examined through the structures and contexts that make it intelligible too. They say that the partial nature of all this outright. The metaphorical concepts we looked at provide us with the partial understanding of what communication, argument, and time are. Lakoff and Johnson, page 12. That's a real limitation, not just a side note. Metaphor gives access, not total access, but the limit isn't on what crosses over, it's on what gets opened up. Some aspects of a concept get made available, the rest stay folded inside the structure that arrived. For this whole project, that means that structure transfer should never be confused with complete understanding. The whole source domain moves. What doesn't move is full access to it, only parts that get unpacked, while the rest is there and used, available but untouched. That is why metaphor needs this much scrutiny. What gets unpacked shapes understanding, but what stays compressed matters just as much. Now their discussion of structural metaphors brings this pathway up to actual question of structural transfer. Structural metaphors allow us, in addition, to use one highly structured and clearly delineated concept to structure another. Lakoff and Johnson, page 61. This is where metaphor becomes mechanism. Metaphor isn't just decorating language or expressing a comparison. A structural metaphor lets one organized domain provide structure for another domain entirely. The precise point isn't that one concept gets understood through another, it's that the source concept brings its own organization along with it, complete, compressed, which makes the question unavoidable. If one structure concept is being used to structure another, I have to ask which parts of that structure get unpacked and put to work, which stay folded up, and what that does to the interpretation. And so that's, I can go back there because that's, and I can explain some of that. So if you're going, what the hell, what did you just say? Okay. So when we talked about man as wolf, okay, here's wolf again. We'll use my wolf. So when I talked about man as wolf and we talked about wolf and I saw this funny furry guy on all fours, and that's man as wolf, and I think it's funny, not scary, and so it's the same thing. So what it's saying is if one structure concept is being used to structure another, what parts of that structure get unpacked, what get put to work, which stay folded up and dormant, and what does it do to interpretation on the subject. So not just that it does interpret, but the next step of what does it do once it's interpreted. And so I'm asking the next levels of questions. So wolf, I'm asking here, I'm not asking, like right now I'm not asking about man, we're looking at wolf. So why did only parts of the structure get unpacked and put to work, and which stayed folded up and dormant in this structure? And what does that do to interpretation from man outward? So, if that makes sense. One more thing they are careful to add. Structural metaphors are not arbitrary inventions floating free of experience. Like orientational or ontological metaphors, structural metaphors are grounded in systemic correlations within our experience. Lakoff and Johnson, page 61. That grounding keeps metaphor tied to lived bodily, cultural, practical experience. A metaphor doesn't get structurally powerful just because someone invents a clever comparison. It gets powerful when the relation between domains is backed by patterns people already recognize from living. For this pathway, that's the point. Structural transfer isn't random. It depends upon pattern correlations that make one domain available in the first place as a way of organizing another. Now we're on to Mary Hesse. Mary Hesse, Models, Analogy, and Scientific Explanation. She's very technical. I might just kind of go through a few things, but because she is very technical. But okay, Mary Hesse. Mary Hesse takes this pathway from conceptual metaphor into scientific explanation. Black shows metaphor working through systems of associated implications. Lakoff and Johnson show it structuring thought and experience. Hesse show why analogy and metaphor carry structural weight for scientific models. Specifically, moving this project past ordinary language and into theory formation. Scientific models don't simply mirror reality. They use one structure to help explain another, which puts them right in the center of the structural transfer question. She is the bridge between metaphor as conceptual organization and metaphor as an actual method for building, testing, and revising explanation. She starts by ruling out that the idea that models are decorations added into scientific theories after the fact. Models, in some sense, are essential to the logic of scientific theories. Hesse, page 7. That moves the discussion from metaphor as a way of speaking into models as part of how scientific explanation actually work. A model isn't just an illustration of a theory. It organizes what can be seen, compared, tested, explained. Structural transfer isn't only a language problem, it's an explanation problem too. One system or structure can be used to make another system intelligible. Then comes the vocabulary for sorting a model structure into what's kept, what's rejected, and what's still unknown. Using billiard balls and molecules as the example, let's call those properties we know belong to billiard balls and not to molecules the negative analogy of the model. Hesse, page 8. The positive analogy is the opposite case. Motion and impact, on the other hand, are just the properties of billiard balls that we do want to ascribe to molecules in our model. Hesse, page 8. Hold on. We'll use a visual. We'll pretend this is a billiard ball. Molecules. Okay? So what she's talking about in this comparison of models is billiard balls and molecules, calling these properties we know billiard balls and molecules that they do not have things in common are called the negative analogy, and the positive analogy is the opposite case, like motion and impact. On the other hand, they're properties of billiard balls that we want to ascribe to, that molecules and billiard balls have those things in common. Okay? And then there's a third category between them that will generally be some properties of the model about which we do not yet know whether they are positive or negative analogies. Hesse, page 8. That's the actual unpacking work made explicit. The full billiard ball concept arrives compressed inside the model. Color, solidity, visibility, all of it, right along with motion and impact. Building the model means going through that compressed structure and sorting it out. Some features get explicitly rejected as not applying to molecules. Some get deliberately kept, and some stay uncertain until inquiry sorts out which is which. The uncertain part of the analogy isn't just a weakness in the model. It's where actual actually becomes possible. Hesse writes that these uncertain properties allow us to make new predictions, Hesse page 8, and makes the same point again later, more generally. An analogy may be used predictively, Hesse page 62. So I want to stop there because what I want to just say plainly is what she's saying is this space. So what she's talking about, we have a model here, we have a model here. When we make scientific theories, we take a model that's similar and we take the negative analogies away, that ones that we don't think apply to molecules from billiard balls, and then we can apply that structure here. But there's like these other properties that don't quite know what to do with, and those are the uncertain properties that we're not quite sure. And so what she's saying is these uncertain properties is where it allows us to make new predictions. These uncertain properties is where science happens. This is where it allows us to ask new questions, new directions, figure out, hey, there's something here, but it's not, they're not connected yet. Or what are these properties and what are these two scientific theories doing to each other with these properties that have not been questioned or looked at or something like that. So that's what she's doing here, is she's pointing this out, is that in that gray area, or not that gray area, that area of unknowns is actually unknowns, and that's where we can make scientific predictions from, is that area. Which I think is pretty cool. I think it's a pretty cool thing that she stated twice. The uncertain part of the analogy isn't just a weakness in the model, it's where new inquiry becomes possible. All right. A model doesn't just summarize what's already known. Once a relation is established between two domains, it can suggest what else might be true, what should be looked for, what could happen next. For structural transfer, that's the real stakes. The stakes extend both directions. The transferred structure doesn't only organize present understanding, it shapes the questions that become possible next, and which ones don't. This uncertain middle area gets a name. Let's call this third set of properties the neutral analogy, Hesse page 8. That gives this project more language for the uncertain middle of structural transfer. Some features clearly get kept, some clearly get rejected, and there's a third category whose status isn't known yet. Structural transfer was never only about the structure that arrives, that part is total. It's just as much about what gets unpacked from it, what stays uncertain, what still needs testing, and what might still go either way. Models could also just fail. After walking through how the billiard ball model helps explain some molecular properties, she's blunt about what happens when it stops working. We have the wrong model, page 9, Hesse page 9. That's the risk built into structural transfer in one sentence. A model can make something intelligible, but it can just as easily mislead once the source structure no longer fits the target domain. Structural transfer isn't automatically valid just because one domain can be used to explain another. The real question is whether the transferred structure clarifies the target, distorts it, or reaches the point where the model has to be revised or dropped. There's a broader version of this analogy concept too, existing through shared properties between two objects at all. An analogy may be said to exist between two objects in virtue of their common properties. Hesse, page 58. She uses the Earth and Moon as her example. Their shared properties form the positive analogy. Their differences form a negative analogy. What that framework makes possible is something history keeps demonstrating on its own. What I'm explaining here is history, because in her own book, she writes about how Earth and Moon and living and also like Venus being a candidate to live on, and our analogy between Earth and Moon and the possibility of living on Moon. Okay, why that framework makes visible is something history keeps demonstrating on its own. Which properties count as positive or negative analogy isn't fixed. It isn't fixed. Positive and negative analogy isn't fixed. It shifts as understanding deepens. Venus was once a candidate for a livable second Earth, closer to us in size than Mars, once imagined as a sister planet, until probes revealed the heat, the crushing pressure, the sulfuric clouds, and the positive analogy. And then the positive analogy collapsed into a negative one almost entirely. So Earth and Moon, Venus, Earth and Venus collapsed entirely. Mars took the opposite path. For decades, it was written off as a dead, thin air rock, and it's now the actual target because what counted as uncertain, once it was in that uncertain area, water, history, day length, polar ice, it kept resolving towards positive analogy the more that we learned. This is not just a second illustration of positive and negative analogy. Neutral analogy isn't a fixed category, it's a process. She gets even more precise about the structure of analogy by splitting it into relations within each domain and relations across domains. Horizontal and vertical relations, Hesse, page 59. Analogy isn't just a loose resemblance between two things. It's a structure of relations. Horizontal relations sit inside each domain. Vertical relations are the correspondences drawn between them. Structural transfer depends upon both levels. One domain doesn't simply resemble another in isolation. Parts of one relational structure get aligned with parts of another. Transfer was never about just shared properties. It's about how relations get mapped, compared, carried across. She says the thesis of this paper is the deductive model of scientific explanation should be modified and supplemented by a view of theoretical explanation as metaphoric redescription of the domain of the explanandum. Hesse, page 157. Metaphor isn't alongside explanation. Here it is the explanation. She isn't treating metaphor as a decorative addition to science. Theoretical explanation can work through metaphoric redescription. One domain gets redescribed through another to make it intelligible. That is where the problem changes register. Structural transfer isn't only a language problem or a conceptual problem. It's an explanatory one, too, because models and metaphors can reshape how a domain gets understood in the first place. Hesse then ties the pathway together herself. The view I shall present is essentially due to Max Black. Hesse, page 158. That means Black, Lakoff, and Johnson and Hesse were never three separate sources lined up next to each other. Black explains metaphor's interaction between systems of implication. Lakoff and Johnson extend that into conceptual structure and experience. Hesse brings in the same interactional structure understanding into scientific explanation. She even names a specific parallel. Black developed a parallelism between the use of literary metaphor and the use of models in theoretical science. Hesse, page 158. And on the same page, insists metaphor has to be taken seriously as more than ornament. Metaphor is more than decorative literary device, and that it has cognitive implications whose nature is a proper subject of philosophic discussion. Hesse, page 158. Metaphor, analogy, and models were never separate problems. They are different ways of asking the same question: how one structure gets used to understand another. She also puts limits on her own claim. She explains, it is certainly not the case that all explanations are metaphoric. Hesse, page 171. That keeps this argument from getting too broad. She isn't claiming metaphor explains everything or that every act of explanation is metaphorical. She's only claiming that metaphor can become explanatory under certain conditions. That distinction is necessary. Structural transfer shouldn't be treated as a universal explanation for all meaning, all models, all theories. It's a specific problem. When one domain is used to understand another, what gets unpacked from the structure that arrives, what stays dormant, and under what conditions does that unpacking clarify rather than distort? Conclusion. This paper has traced a pathway from pragmatics and sociolinguistics into translation, metaphor, conceptual structure, and scientific models. Each stage revealed the same underlying problem. Meaning is never isolated, complete, or self-contained. It depends on context, structure, and relation. Pragmatics showed language operating through social action. Translation showed that meaning can't be reduced to a word equivalence. In metaphor, Black showed works through interaction and associated implications, structuring thought, action, and experience, not just describing them. Models and analogies, Hesse showed, depend on that same kind of structural relationship between domains, sorted afterward into what holds and what doesn't. Across pragmatics, translation, metaphor, conceptual structure, analogy, and scientific models, the same problem keeps surfacing. Meaning never moves alone. When one domain is used to understand another, something more than a label or comparison moves with it. Assumptions, limits, relations, expectations, and rules for what is relevant. Black, Lecoff, and Johnson and Hesse each show pieces of this happening in language, in thought, in scientific models, but none of them ask directly what happens once that structure has moved and the metaphor that carried it is no longer being noticed as metaphor at all. This paper has not answered that question. It has shown why the question needs to be asked. I know, are you disappointed? All that. And I didn't even answer your question. I just showed you the foundation. The next stage of this work takes up that question directly. What exactly travels when one domain structure is used to organize another, and what happens to the part of it that never gets used at all? This paper has built the foundation for that question rather than its answer, tracing the pathway from everyday language through metaphor, conceptual structure, and scientific models, and showing through Black, Lecoff, and Johnson and Hesse together why this pathway leads somewhere existing theory has not yet gone. And that is my paper. I'm going to read my references. References: Black M, 1962, Models and Metaphors, Cornell University Press. Hesse, MB, 1970, Models and Analogies in Science, University of Notre Dame Press. Lecoff G. and Johnson M., 1980, Metaphors We Live By, University of Chicago Press. Those are my references from my paper. So that's everything. That was my paper that I turned in for paper 1 of Metaphor, Language, and Theoretical Structure. And if anybody has any serious comments, really serious comments, I would love to hear them. Subscribe to my channel. My next papers are not going to be this dry, I promise. The next one, because this class is not in scientific theory, my class is actually categorized in writing. So I don't have to write in scientific language or theory or argument kind of things, but my next paper I think is going to be more relational kind of wording and showing you my theory and showing you what Lecoff, Johnson, Max Black, Mary Hesse, and a few other people are showing you. And so it'll be fun. It'll be different. It'll be interesting, maybe even. Something I've enjoyed writing. So it's not going to be dry like this, I promise. So like my page, subscribe, do whatever you do. But thank you so much for being here with me, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.